So you are encouraging us to think that, ci incoraggia a pensare che nella cultura industriale l'investimento invisibile, in particolare gli investimenti in conoscenza, in avanzamento delle conoscenze, possano essere una priorità. Non è purtroppo così frequente trovare questo. Lo stesso tema, potrei passare la parola a Mariana Mazzucato, che è anche un po' italiana perché ha vissuto un certo periodo da noi, adesso insegna al Sussex, che è una delle università più proiettate verso la Innovation Theory and l'Innovation Policies. E le chiederei appunto una sua riflessione pure su che tipo di politiche industriali per il XXI secolo e magari con un riferimento, se possibile, all'esperienza inglese che lei conosce più da vicino. Si può dire che l'Inghilterra abbia una politica industriale? Tutti abbiamo in mente un sistema industriale. Prego, Mariana.
Okay, I think I'd prefer to arrive to the UK situation at the end of my comments and first just sort of step back, because I think that one of the aspects that have really limited how we think about innovation and how we think about industrial policy, and then the specific policies that we actually create, is that we've limited our understanding of the role of the state. And let me just give you quickly the sort of overview, is that there's basically two different perspectives. One is that the state basically enters to fix problems in the market. So the reason that it needs to invest in R&D, for example, is because it's very hard to appropriate things like basic research, so there's not enough spending by private firms in R&D, hence the state does that. That's the state fixing a problem in the market. Some people also in my institution who was actually quite path-breaking in setting up this other framework is called the National Systems of Innovation, which has instead focused more on framework conditions, horizontal policies, many of which we already spoke about this morning. Horizontal links, for example, between science and industry, a proper education system, a well-distributed finance system, both venture capital, banks, etc. What I think has been missing is a third dimension, which I've called in some recent writings the entrepreneurial role of the state. And what I mean by that is something very specific. I mean the risk-taking role. And by risk-taking, I mean the good risk, okay? So Frank Knight, who is a great theoretician of risk, said, without uncertainty, there would be no point in having an idea. So in fact, innovation, in a way, traces itself from the beginning, from the fact you have uncertainty. Otherwise, in a certain world, there would be no point in even engaging. And what is very interesting when you look at particular countries from the US, China, and Brazil today that have been successful in particular moments of their history in terms of achieving innovation-led growth, because growth doesn't only come from innovation, it has been, I think, in a particular period in which the state was willing to act in an entrepreneurial way, which, again, what I mean is by taking on sort of high risk, high uncertainty, but not described as it was in the previous session, which was, again, described in terms of a market failure problem. It's really in terms of the vision. And if I have to say what's missing in Europe today, I really do think it's a vision, sort of. And I don't mean by that a common vision. I mean a vision of what the state is for. So, go back to Silicon Valley. Before the financial crisis, the big question in Europe was why aren't there enough Googles, or why aren't there any Googles coming out of Europe? Why are all the really innovative high-tech companies mainly coming out of the US? And one of the big answers we had to that question was, because we don't have enough venture capital. We have too heavy hand of the state, or as the Economist calls it, the Leviathan. They have the market model. They also have all this efficient, they have these garage tinkerers, venture capital, small firms, and the state is less heavy. It couldn't be farther from the truth. If you actually look at the history of Silicon Valley, there was extremely heavy hand of the US government in about 14 different agencies, only one of which was DARPA, which many people know because it was basically responsible for inventing the internet, even commercializing it. And what is very interesting when you actually look at the history of particular industries that came out of Silicon Valley was that the vision, so not just the funding, but also the vision for these industries actually also came out of government. So nanotechnology is a perfect example. The word nanotech came out of civil servants, not wearing sandals like Bill Gates, probably wearing a tie like these guys, but they had the vision for nanotechnology. And this is very important because it's not that you had the business sector that wanted to invest in nanotech and went to government and said, can you please fix these problems and these things that we need? The vision itself came. And also, another thing is radical innovation. It's not that we always need radical innovation, we also need lots of diffusion. However, the big myth out there, and there's a wonderful introduction in The Economist in the three or four issues ago where it talks about the third industrial revolution and the myth that they also propagate. And I think the quote was something like, the government should stick to the basics, invest in skills and some research and some education, but then let the revolutionaries do their thing. So the big myth is that the revolutionary, the visionary, the creativity is always somehow in the private sector. And all that government has to do, again, is either fix the market failures or create the conditions. And this couldn't be farther from the truth. Again, if anyone's interested, I wrote a little book about this called The Entrepreneurial State, and I don't want to market it because it's free. But it's extremely important as a distinction. And Keynes, by the way, in a wonderful letter he wrote to Roosevelt in 1936, hinted at this, but he never developed it. He said, you know what, these businesses, they're actually not wolves or lions. They're actually domesticated animals. And once you accept that it's not true that government is the sort of necessary but inertial hand and the private sector is always the kind of crazy dynamic side, and hence limit what government is for, it completely changes your policies. And I don't want to say too much, but just think of the iPad or the iPhone that most of you have. Every bit of the iPhone, GPS, touchscreen display, the internet, all the communication technology was actually funded by the US government. And then you needed someone like Steve Jobs, who in this famous Stanford speech said you have to be crazy and foolish, but fine, it's easy to be crazy and foolish when you have the wave of these major investments to then surf on. And this is also one of the problems with venture capital, that when we said in Europe we need more venture capital, we didn't do what Silicon Valley did, which is to allow venture capital to ride the waves of these state investments, because VC, venture capital in biotech, for example, came in 20 years after the state made these investments, which is not to say state good, private sector inertial. It's just to say that we've been always assuming the opposite, and making that wrong assumption has, again, limited the policies. For example, getting the whole venture capital market wrong, I think, in Europe. Because I think someone else mentioned before, within a sector, you can actually divide it up. Put, for example, capital intensity on the vertical axis, and on the horizontal axis, technological and market risk, divided into four. The upper right-hand quadrant is where the private sector tends not to go. So it makes no sense, A, to assume that it will go there, and, for example, to set up something like the Green Investment Bank, which the UK has done, trying to simply nudge the private sector to do these really radical things, which it's been trying to nudge them into, because they never have. The private sector has actually never done the really capital-intensive, high uncertainty, high technological risk areas. Government has always had to, if you want, kick off the wave there. It also doesn't make sense to, for example, often assume that the only problem is technology transfer. Often what is missing in Europe are, in fact, these major investments. And so there's not actually much to transfer sometimes. It's sort of like pushing on a string. And just 2 points arise from this. Once you accept that the state can play this entrepreneurial, risk-taking role, again, it was the state that funded the algorithm behind Google. How many people know that? Again, every bit of the iPad. In pharmaceuticals, this is my favorite industry, because they love lobbying government, in all sorts of ways. And they always say, too much red tape. Red tape, if you take all the medicines, the actual medicines you buy in the pharmacy, you divide them up on whether they are actually new molecular entities or Me Too drugs. So, slight variation of an existing drug. Viagra, different color, different dosage. And the new molecular entities, divide them up if they're a priority or not. 80% of the priority-rated new molecular entities are funded and sometimes even commercialized by National Institute of Health laboratories. Private pharma is not as innovative and risk-taking and entrepreneurial as it likes to say it is, and it often does very high prices, which the taxpayers then cannot buy, even though they funded it, based on their really high R&D. But actually what private pharma is very good at is more the D, the marketing. However, unfortunately, even the NIH labs have now been captured as you were saying before, and they are carrying out even the clinical trials. So, my question is, what is private pharma then going to do if basically they're allowing the public sector to almost do it all, but then they get the reward? So this is a really important point. Just 2 quick points and I'll stop. One is risks and rewards. What I think has been happening in the recent years, where we talk about open innovation, information economy, the knowledge economy, is that we've seen innovation become increasingly collective, and the risk-taking process has become increasingly collective, at the same time that the rewards from this process have become increasingly privatized. And until we admit that, the EC 2020 agenda of smart, inclusive, sustainable growth is just trendy talk. There are some countries like Brazil which have thought about this recently, very concretely, and they've set up, for example, their state investment bank, BNDES, which not only operates counter-cyclically, which is one of the main reasons you need a state investment bank, because private banks during recessions lend out too little and during booms lend out too much. So the government investment bank, like in Germany, has to play that counter-cyclical role. But on top of that, they've been extremely entrepreneurial and have been investing massively in the pretty high-risk areas in both renewables and biotech, and they make a lot of money. 20% return on equity they've been making. The Treasury takes almost all of it back, redistributes in the economies, whether it's to the favelas, education, whatever, but they then keep 20% of that 20%, reinvest, and anyway, it's just a tool through which some of the rewards can be reaped back. Another tool that could be invented, if we at least talked about it, and my point is we don't even talk about it, because we don't allow ourselves to think of the state in this way, of this entrepreneurial actually earning potential returns, is income contingent loans. Why did no money go back to the government when it funded the Google algorithm, or Apple, Compaq, Intel? All the early stage money for those companies did not come from private venture capital. It came from the SBIR, which is almost like a public venture capital. Why not do an income contingent loan? So if you earn above X amount, at least a little bit comes back. So provocatively, if the government had earned back a direct return from the internet of even just 0.01%, you can bet there'd be so much more today to invest in green. Lastly, this also means that you need to set up entrepreneurial agencies in government, because it's not enough to say, oh, of course, government can be entrepreneurial. As we know, whether it's in Italy, Greece, or whatever, you don't often have, or even in the UK, these entrepreneurial departments like DARPA. But you don't even engage in that discussion until you admit that the government can play this entrepreneurial role. So you need to start thinking of how to change the organizational culture. So I've been talking about this quite a bit, and this one minister in the UK recently said, oh yeah, and because Professor Mazzucato says that the TSB, the Technology Strategy Board, which is responsible for thinking about industrial policy in the UK, should become DARPA, we're going to throw 75 million more at it. I was like, no, don't do that. You first transform it, and then you throw money at it. Otherwise, it's just going to become another little, potentially just bureaucratic organization with a lot of money and be easily captured. So thinking strategically in industrial, because it's part of industrial policy. Both these things are risks and rewards are part of industrial policy, and we need to start talking about it, and how to set up these government agencies so they can actually act entrepreneurially should also be part of government policy.
Grazie, professore.